trembling with hunger, 3 days off the road out of Grover, Adeline was about to have 4 blunt words change her life. Could she cook for 2? She did not know it yet, kneeling in the ditch grass at the edge of a fence line. She had no business crossing, picking withered chokecherries off a half-dead bush with fingers gone raw and colorless from 3 nights sleeping under nothing but sky. The berries were sour and mostly seed, more memory of food than food itself, and she made herself chew each one slow, the way her mother had taught her to stretch a Sunday roast across a whole week of suppers. Nothing had, not since Grover, not since the bank man in the clean collar had stood in her parlor, reading out the sum of everything her husband owed, and every single thing she owned had been carried out the front door to cover it. She had 26 cents sewn into her hem and a carpet bag, with 2 dresses in it, and she was 24 years old, and felt some mornings older than the dust she walked through. The sound came before the sight of it, a slow, patient creak of leather, the soft percussion of a horse's hooves working through thick road dust, unhurried, a rhythm that belonged to a man who had somewhere to be but no reason to rush getting there. Adeline did not look up right away. Her pride, foolish and stubborn and the last whole thing she still owned, made her keep her eyes on the bush, made her put another sour berry between her teeth as though she were savoring a fine meal and not scavenging like a stray dog at a fence line that plainly belonged to somebody. The horse stopped. She felt the weight of a gaze settle over her, steady, unhurried, the kind of look a man gives a piece of weather he means to understand before he decides what to do about it. When she finally lifted her chin, the sun was behind him, and for a moment he was only a shape, broad through the shoulders, hat pulled low, a stillness to him that had nothing soft in it and nothing cruel either. This is Wyoming territory, the autumn of 1887, and the starving widow, eating weeds off a stranger's fence line, was named Adeline Marsh, a woman who had just buried a husband, a house, and every plan she'd ever made for her own life. What that stranger on the horse was about to ask her would not just feed her. It would hand her a ranch to run, a hard, guarded man's heart to win honestly, and by the time the first snow fell, it would put her toe-to-toe with a Laramie banker who had never once in his career been outsmarted by the woman standing at the stove. Stay to the end of this one. What Adeline does with 11 half-grown steers and a page of arithmetic will floor you. Now let's go back to the beginning, 3 days earlier, to a house in Grover that no longer belonged to her. Adeline had watched them carry her mother's clock out the door first, then the good chairs, then the bed she had shared with Daniel Marsh for the 4 years of their marriage, a marriage that had looked, from the outside, like the sort of thing a woman could count on, a husband with a shop, a house with a porch. What the town had not known, what Adeline herself had not fully understood until the week after the funeral, was that Daniel had spent the last 2 years of his life borrowing against everything he owned to chase one bad investment after another. He had died of a fever in the spring, sudden and unremarkable, the kind of death that leaves no time for a wife to ask the questions that might have saved her. The bank had come for the rest of it in June. By July, Adeline Marsh had nothing left in Grover but a name spoken in Grover with a mixture of pity and relief that it hadn't happened to them. She had thought at first that she might find work in town, mending, laundry, something respectable enough for a widow with no family left to take her in. But Grover was small, and word of the Marsh debts had traveled faster than Adeline could knock on doors, and, a woman connected to that much ruin made people nervous the way a house fire 2 doors down makes people nervous. So she had walked west, because west was where the land opened up and a person could disappear into distance instead of gossip, with a carpet bag holding 2 dresses, a comb, a small tin box of her mother's buttons, and a grief that had gone hard and quiet in her chest, the way grief does when a person cannot afford any longer to indulge it. 3 days on the road had taught her things about herself. She had not particularly wanted to learn that her feet could bleed through a pair of good boots, and she would keep walking anyway. That hunger, given enough time, stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like simply the way things were. That she was, underneath the parlor, manners, and the mended lace collars, a great deal tougher than anyone in Grover, including, she suspected, herself had ever given her credit for being. She was not a small woman, not delicate in the way the town ladies had always seemed to prize. She had a full work-capable figure, even now, gone lean and hollow-cheeked with hunger, but still unmistakably a woman men's eyes followed on a street, dark hair coming loose from its pins, a wide, expressive mouth that had forgotten these last 3 days what it felt like to smile without effort. She had promised herself walking. That pride was a useless thing to carry when a person was starving. She had not yet managed to put it down. She remembered, with a clarity she wished she didn't still have, the homestead 2 days back where she had knocked timidly at a kitchen door and inquired plainly whether there was any work to be had, mending, laundry, anything, and the farm wife who opened it had looked her over from bonnet to hem, taken in the fine, travel-ruined cut of her dress, and informed her, not unkindly, that a woman who dressed like that had clearly never done an honest day's work, and ought to try town instead. Adeline had not corrected her. There had not seemed any point. She had learned in the space of that one conversation that looking like she had once belonged to a comfortable house was, out here, its own kind of liability, proof to strangers that whatever hard thing had brought her low was probably her own fault, some extravagance she'd finally been made to answer for. No one inquired about the debts, or about Daniel, or the fever, or the 2 quiet years of borrowing she hadn't known enough to stop. They only saw the good boots wearing thin now, and decided the rest of the story for themselves. She had slept that night in a dry creek bed under a shawl that did nothing against the cold, and woken stiff-jointed with her stomach a hollow, insistent ache, and made herself a private promise, watching the sun come up over a country that owed her nothing. She would do it without apology and without explaining. Nobody out here was owed her story. They were only owed a fair day's labor. And that, at least, she still knew exactly how to give. The fence line she'd stopped at belonged, she would learn within the hour, to a man named Wyatt Calloway, and it ran for what looked like miles in both directions, taut and well-strung, posts set true, wire strung tight enough to sing faintly in the wind, the fence of a man who did not let things fall apart around him, whatever else might be true of his life. Beyond it, low buildings sat scattered across a rolling stretch of high plains, grass, a house, a barn, a scatter of outbuildings, all of it modest and solid, and even from this distance plainly a working ranch and not a gentleman's showpiece. She had been looking at those buildings for a good 10 minutes, doing arithmetic she did not like the answer to when the horse and rider came around the bend in the road. Wyatt Calloway swung down out of the saddle in one economical motion, the kind that comes from having done a thing 10,000 times and never once thought about how it looked. He was a solid man, was the word that came to Adeline's mind and would not leave it. Solid, the way the fence was solid, the way the land itself was solid, built for enduring rather than impressing. He took off his hat, which she had not expected, and held it against his thigh, and underneath it his hair was the pale gold of hay, left too long in a field, and his eyes, when he finally looked directly at her, were a faded, weathered blue, the color of sky right before a storm scrubs it clean. He looked at the berries in her hand. He looked at the carpet bag beside her in the dirt. He did not smile. He did not frown either. His face did the thing she would come, over the following months, to understand as entirely characteristic of him. It simply took in information, without judgment attached, the way a man reads weather before he decides whether to bring in the herd. "Those won't fill you," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, entirely without pity in it, which was somehow the only thing that kept Adeline from bursting into tears right there in the dirt. "No," she agreed. He studied her a moment longer, glanced back toward the low buildings behind him, and seemed, in the silence that followed, to be weighing something on an internal scale only he could see. He was not, she would learn, a man who rushed toward conclusions. When he finally resumed, it was not the question she had braced herself for, not in order to move along, not a suspicious demand for her business on his land, not even, God forbid. It was simpler and stranger than any of that. "Can you cook for two?" Adeline blinked. Of everything she had steeled herself to hear from a stranger on a lonely stretch of Wyoming road, that particular sentence had not made the list. It was not pity. It was not a command. It was, she understood with a small, disbelieving jolt somewhere under her ribs, a job offer, plain, unadorned, and utterly without conditions attached beyond the one she'd already met. Something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 straight days loosened, just slightly, just enough to let a breath through. She thought of her mother's boarding house, the threshing crews she'd fed by the dozen as a girl, every meal she had ever cooked for a table full of hungry, tired people. She straightened her spine as much as 3 days of empty walking would allow. "I can cook for 20, she said. Something that was almost but not quite a smile moved at the corner of Wyatt Calloway's mouth. He did not offer his name yet. He simply set his hat back on his head, turned, and swung up onto his horse, motioning with his chin for her to follow the fence line toward the buildings in the distance. Adeline picked up her carpet bag and, for the first time in 3 days, walked with something other than dread carrying her forward. If you're the kind of viewer who stays until the porch light comes on, do one thing for me. Become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name. It's a small click that means a great deal to a channel this size. The walk to the ranch house took the better part of 20 minutes, Wyatt's horse setting an easy pace that Adeline suspected was slower than his usual, as though he had noticed, without remarking on it, the state of her boots and her strength. The silence between them was not the awkward kind. It was, she would come to learn, simply how Wyatt Calloway moved through the world, economical with words the same way he was, economical with motion, saying only what needed saying. He did not ask her story. She was grateful for that more than she had words to say. Her story was heavy enough without narrating it to a stranger on a dusty road. The ranch house, when they reached it, was much like the man who owned it, solid, plain, built to withstand wind and snow rather than to please the eye. A structure of pure function with none of the small softening touches a woman's hand tends to leave on a house. Inside, the evidence of a woman's long absence was everywhere. Dust lay thick and undisturbed across the mantel. A leaning stack of unopened mail and ledgers threatened to slide off the corner of the dining table. The kitchen, when Wyatt led her into it, was worse than the rest of the house combined. A skillet crusted with some ancient breakfast sat abandoned on a cold stove, tins of beans stacked with no particular order on a shelf gone gray with grease, a flour bin scraped down to a dusting at the bottom. It was, plainly, a room that had given up trying. Adeline set her carpetbag down by the door and took a long breath of stale coffee and neglect, and felt something rise in her that was not despair, but its precise opposite. She saw a kitchen that needed a competent hand more than it needed anything else on earth, and competent hands were at this exact moment in her life the one thing she had left to offer anybody. She turned to Wyatt, who stood in the doorway watching her with that same unreadable, assessing quiet, as though bracing for her to turn around and walk right back out the door the way any sensible woman might. "Is there a well pump?" she asked. "Outback soap?" He nodded toward a hard bar of lye soap sitting on the dry sink, gray and cracked with disuse. "I'll need more than that," Adeline said. "And rags and a bucket and whatever flour and lard you've got in the root cellar." If you've got a root cellar, he didn't argue. He didn't apologize for the state of the house, which she noticed and quietly respected. He simply went to fetch what she'd requested, and that, more than the offer of work itself, was the moment Adeline decided she might actually be able to stay in this house. That first evening she did not cook for 2 or for 20. She scrubbed the stove and the counters until her arms burned, hauled water until her shoulders screamed, and by the time the light outside had gone the color of a bruise, she had found half a sack of beans, a hunk of salt pork, and an onion sprouting green in a forgotten corner of the cellar, and turned them into a pot of soup thick enough to stand a spoon in. She ate her first bowl of it sitting alone at the newly scrubbed table, and it tasted, she would tell people years later, like salvation itself. When Wyatt came in from evening chores and found the kitchen transformed, surfaces gleaming, the smell of onion and pork and clean soap replacing the old grease and dust, he stopped dead in the doorway and simply looked at it for a long moment before he looked at her. She had a bowl waiting for him, and a rough round of cornbread made from the last of the meal in a dusty canister. He sat and ate without a word, cleaned the bowl to the last drop, wiped it with the bread, and pushed the plate away with the particular satisfaction of a man who has forgotten over a long stretch of solitary years. Then he mentioned the 12 men who'd be riding in the following week for the fall gather, and about the wagon that would carry her into Grover at first light for supplies, and about nothing else, because that, Adeline was learning fast, was simply the shape of conversation in this house, practical, spare, and entirely without wasted breath. He carried his own plate to the sink and washed it himself before he went to bed, a small gesture that revealed more about the kind of man she was working for than any speech could have. The next morning she was up before the sun without needing reminding, because a kitchen that size did not run itself, and she meant to have it running like a proper kitchen long before 12 hands arrived expecting to be fed. Wyatt found her already at the stove when he came down for his own coffee, hair pinned back, sleeves rolled to the elbow, coaxing a stubborn fire out of a flue that plainly hadn't been swept in longer than she cared to guess. He showed her without much ceremony where the woodpile was kept dry, which spring fed the well pump sweetest, and which of the hens out back were worth the trouble of chasing, and which had gone too old and mean to bother with. It was the longest unbroken stretch of talking she'd heard out of him yet, and she noticed, filing it away the way she filed away most things about this quiet, careful man, that he only ever talked at length about things that were useful, never about himself. Never about the wife whose absence still hung over the house like a smell that had faded, but never quite left. By mid-morning, she had taken stock of the pantry properly for the first time, counted flour sacks and coffee tins and the sorry state of the root cellar, and, drawn up, on the back of an old feed receipt, a list of everything the ranch would need before 12 hungry men descended on it. She found Wyatt out by the barn, mending a bridle, and handed him the list without comment. He read it over, made no comment about the length of it, and simply nodded, folding it into his shirt pocket like a man accepting an order he had no intention of arguing with. It was, Adeline thought, walking back toward the house, the first time in longer than she could remember that anyone had trusted her judgment without first making her prove it twice over. She found she liked the feeling of it a great deal more than she'd expected to. The wagon ride into Grover, a different Grover than the one she'd walked out of only 3 days before, though it was the very same dusty street, took the better part of a morning. Sun-cured hand named Cully, who had worked the Callaway spread longer than anyone, and eyed Adeline the entire ride with the particular wariness ranch hands reserve for anything liable to upset the order they've settled into. He did not say much. What he did say, delivered somewhere around the halfway point of the drive with no particular malice in it, only a flat sort of certainty, was that the boss had tried a cook before a fellow from Laramie, hired the previous spring, gone inside of 3 weeks once the real work started, and that Cully, personally, gave a starved widow off the road even odds of lasting through the fall gather, let alone the winter that came after it. Adeline said nothing to that. She filed it away the way she filed away most things people underestimated her for, and went about the business of buying flour and lard and dried apples and the largest sack of coffee the mercantile carried, paying out of a small advance Wyatt had pressed into her hand without comment before she left. It was at the mercantile counter, counting out coins with the storekeeper, that she first felt the weight of a particular pair of eyes on her, a heavy-set, well-dressed rancher named Otis Vance. Never once in his life passed up an opportunity to bet against another man's fortune. "So you're Callaway's new cook," Vance said, not quite a question, leaning against the counter with the easy confidence of a man used to being listened to. "Heard he picked you up off the road, half-starved, they're saying." He looked her over with an appraisal that made her skin want to crawl, the sort of look that priced a person the way a man prices a horse. He has no intention of buying. No offense meant, ma'am, but Wyatt Callaway runs a hard outfit. 12 hens come, fall gather, cattle to doctor, books to keep straight, a house gone to ruin these 5 years since his wife passed. I've seen tougher women than you turn tail inside a month. He said it pleasantly, almost kindly, the way a man delivers bad news he privately enjoys delivering. "Matter of fact, I'll lay Henry here $20 you don't see the first snow through." The storekeeper, Henry, evidently had the good grace to look uncomfortable about it. Adeline felt something old and stubborn rise up in her chest, the same thing that had kept her chin level under that sack of a reputation Grover had tried to hang on her, and she found she did not particularly mind Otis Vance's $20 being on the table. It clarified matters wonderfully. "Take the bet, Mr. Vance," she said, sweet as anything, gathering her packages into her arms. "I'd hate for you to miss the chance to lose it." Cully, loading the wagon behind her, made a sound that might, in a more talkative man, have been a laugh. The 12 hands rode in 6 days later, dusty and travel-worn from the long ride down out of the high country. Expecting, Adeline gathered from their guarded sideways glances at her, burned bacon, weak coffee. What they got instead, that first evening, was a stew thick with potatoes and carrots and tender beef, ladled out alongside 2 full pans of biscuits, so light they nearly floated off the plate, and the effect on a dining table of 12 hungry, road-worn men. The usual rough banter went quiet, replaced by the steady scrape of forks and the occasional murmur of pure animal satisfaction. Cully, sitting at the head of the hand's end of the table, cleaned his plate, sat back, and announced to no one in particular that he'd take back roughly half of everything he'd said in that wagon. There was a lanky, sunburned boy of maybe 17 named Jem who ate like he hadn't seen a stove in a month and told her, around a mouthful of biscuit, that this was the finest meal he'd had since his mother passed, then went red to his ears and apologized for talking with his mouth full. There was an older hand named Pruitt, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some long-ago accident he never discussed, who volunteered almost nothing to her directly, but took to leaving a fresh-caught string of trout by the kitchen door most mornings, a wordless thank you she understood perfectly well without needing it explained. And there was Cully, whose skepticism from the wagon ride into Grover thawed a full degree with every meal that came out of that kitchen, until, by the end of the first week, he had taken to pulling out her chair at supper before anyone else could think to. A small courtesy that made the younger hands snicker until he silenced them with a look that promised extra fence mending for the first man who kept it up. The fall gather itself was brutal, punishing work. Long days in the saddle chasing stubborn cattle down out of the high pastures before the weather turned, men riding in each evening caked in dust and exhaustion, saddle-sore and short-tempered. But the sight of lamplight spilling gold out of the ranch house windows and the smell of supper carrying clear across the yard to meet them had a way of straightening a man's spine before he'd even swung down from his horse. Adeline had become, without quite meaning to, the one fixed point the whole operation turned around. Not the boss, never that, but something the men had started depending on in a way none of them, least of all Adeline herself, had expected a starving stranger off the road to become inside of 2 short weeks. From that evening forward, something in the whole rhythm of the ranch shifted. Gradual, but unmistakable. The men started wiping their boots before coming inside, a courtesy nobody had required of them. Arguments over cards in the evening lost their edge. The coffee pot on the stove never sat empty. The cookie jar never sat empty either, and the whole house began to smell, morning and evening, of baking bread and roasting meat, instead of dust and bachelor neglect. Wyatt watched all of it the way he watched weather, carefully, without much comment, but missing nothing. He noticed the sure, efficient way she kneaded bread dough, wrists strong from work, a loose strand of dark hair falling across her face that she pushed back with the heel of her wrist without ever once breaking her rhythm. He noticed, though he could not have named the feeling for a while yet, that he had begun watching her the way a man watches something he is afraid to want too openly. He started doing small things. He fixed the loose board on the back porch step, the one he'd noticed her favoring 100 times a day without ever mentioning it. He took the kitchen knives out one evening and brought them back with an edge sharp enough to shave with. He left a bucket of apples by the kitchen door one afternoon with nothing more than a gruff, "Thought you could use these," by way of explanation, and offering nothing further about it. Adeline noticed every one of these small, wordless gestures, and let them pass without comment either, in the way of two careful people circling something neither one was quite ready to name out loud. The next evening there was a deep dish apple pie waiting on the warming shelf, crust flaking gold, filling sweet with cinnamon she'd found buried in the back of a cupboard. Wyatt took his first bite and went very still, eyes closed, the way a man goes still when a taste reaches back and touches something in him he'd thought was gone for good. Their conversation stayed brief and practical on the surface. Supplies, the weather, how many head to move to the lower pasture before the ground froze. But underneath the plain words, something else had begun quietly building. They were two capable people, each recognizing in the other a competence the world had not always bothered to notice. And they were constructing something together, meal by meal, core by core, in the unhurried way that lasts. The first real test of that quiet trust came on a raw, gray afternoon when an early cold snap blew down out of the mountains, without warning, dropping the temperature 20 degrees inside an hour. Adeline, hauling a kettle of hot water out to the wash bucket by the barn, slipped on a patch of ground gone suddenly slick with frost and went down hard, catching herself on the edge of a feed trough with her bare palm instead of letting the kettle spill scalding water across her skirts. The trough's rusted edge opened a shallow but ugly gash across her palm, and she sat there a moment in the mud, more furious with herself than hurt, pressing her apron against the wound. Wyatt found her there minutes later, coming in early from the fence line at the first sign of the weather turning. And the look that crossed his face at the sight of blood soaking through her apron was sharper and more unguarded than anything she had yet seen from him. He said almost nothing, simply knelt in the mud beside her, took her hand in both of his with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with how calloused and capable those hands were, and walked her inside without argument, ignoring her insistence that it was nothing, that she dealt with worse, that the stew would burn if nobody minded it. He cleaned the cut himself at the kitchen table, hands sure and unhurried despite how carefully he worked, wrapping it in a clean strip of cloth torn from an old shirt, and did not let go of her hand right away once the bandage was tied. "You don't have to prove anything to me," he said quietly, still holding her hand loosely in his thumb brushing once absently over her knuckles in a way that made something in her chest go very still. "Not to Cully, not to Vance, not to any man on this place. You proved it the first week you were here." Adeline looked at him a long moment, at the unfamiliar softness in a face she had only ever seen guarded, and found she did not have a quick, capable answer ready for once in her life. "Old habit," she said finally, quieter than she meant to. "Nobody where I came from waited around to see if I could keep up." "You're not there anymore," Wyatt said, simple and plain, the way he said most things that mattered. He held her gaze a moment longer than either of them was quite prepared for, then let go of her hand, cleared his throat, and went to check on the stew, after all, leaving Adeline sitting at the table with her bandaged palm and a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing at all to do with the kitchen fire. One night, well past the hour when the hands had eaten and gone to the bunkhouse, Wyatt came in late, from mending a stretch of fence line that had gone down in the wind, bone-tired in the particular way that comes from cold work done alone. He found Adeline, still up, mending one of his shirts by lamplight at the kitchen table, a plate waiting for him on the warming shelf under a clean cloth. "Didn't have to wait up," he said, dropping into the chair across from her voice, rough with the day's work. "A man ought to have a hot meal when he comes in," she answered, not looking up from her needle. He ate in silence for a while, watching her hands move, never quite still, always finding some task to occupy them, and something turned over in his chest, slow and unfamiliar. He had lived alone in this house for 5 years since fever took his first wife. He had survived it. He had not, he understood now, with a clarity that unsettled him, actually been living, not until a starving woman had knelt at his fence line, eating chokecherries, and told him she could cook for 20. He thought, some nights, lying awake in the dark, about what the house would go back to being if she ever left it. The thought had a coldness to it he did not care to examine too closely. By the middle of October, the gather was winding down, the last of the cattle pushed into the lower pastures for counting, and a hard-won kind of peace had settled over the ranch, the particular well-earned quiet of a place that had worked itself nearly to the bone, and come out the other side intact. It was Cully who first mentioned, offhand, and without much weight behind it, that he'd heard talk in Grover of a bank man asking around about which outfits in the valley were carrying notes coming due before winter. Wyatt had only grunted at the news and gone back to his coffee, the way he absorbed most bad tidings, filing it away rather than reacting to it, and Adeline had noticed, without remarking on it, the particular stillness that came over him afterward, the stillness of a man doing arithmetic in his head he did not care for the answer to. She had not pressed him outright about what the note was, or how large, or how close to due. It was not, strictly, any of her business, and Wyatt was not a man who volunteered worry easily. But she had begun, in the quiet hours after supper when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Wyatt sat over his ledgers by lamplight, watching him more closely than she let on, noting the particular set of his jaw whenever the mail brought an envelope stamped with the Laramie return address. Whatever was coming, she understood without being informed, was coming soon. And it was coming for the one thing this quiet, careful man had spent his whole life building. The catalyst arrived on a sharp, clear afternoon in late October, in the shape of a sleek, black buggy that looked entirely too polished for the rutted road it had traveled, a buggy that pulled up in front of the house, trailing a man in a city suit and a derby hat, moving with the self-important air of a person who has never once had to wonder whether his next meal was coming. He introduced himself as Latham, of the Laramie Merchants Bank, and Wyatt's face went carefully, deliberately blank, in a way Adeline, peeling potatoes at the kitchen window, recognized immediately as the look of a man bracing for bad news. They sat at the dining table, the same table where 12 hands joked and ate their fill every night, and Latham spread a set of papers across it with the precise, unhurried confidence of a man who has delivered this particular kind of news. It concerned the note Wyatt had taken out that spring for new breeding stock, due at the end of the month. The market for beef, Latham explained, had softened considerably. Word from the Omaha stockyard suggested prices would keep sliding before the snow came. The bank, he said, felt exposed. Adeline, listening from the kitchen doorway with a paring knife still in her hand, understood the shape of the trap even before Latham finished laying it out. Wyatt had planned to cover the note from the proceeds of the Fall Gathers cattle sale. If the market kept falling, he would come up short. Latham knew it, and had come prepared with a solution that was really no solution at all. The bank would buy back the note at a steep discount, taking the land itself as collateral. Sparing Wyatt, Latham said with a thin, condescending smile. It was, dressed up in careful banker's language, and offered to steal the ranch out from under him in broad daylight, entirely within the letter of the law. Wyatt's jaw had gone tight. his hands curling slowly into fists beneath the table's edge, and Adeline could see, even from the doorway, the particular shame of a decent man watching his life's work priced and appraised by someone who had never once swung an axe. He was one breath from telling Latham to get off his land and take his chances with the market, and Adeline, without waiting for permission from anyone, set down her knife, wiped her hands on her apron. "Ma'am, this is a private matter," Latham said, sharp and dismissive, barely glancing up from his papers. Adeline ignored him entirely. She crossed to the small desk in the corner, opened the heavy ledger where Wyatt kept his tallies, and ran her finger down a column of figures with the calm, unhurried confidence of a woman who had spent a great many evenings unnoticed, learning exactly how this ranch's books balanced. "You tallied 460 head for the main drive this fall," she said, her voice steady, cutting cleanly through Latham's rising protest. Wyatt watched her, startled, but did not stop her. He had learned these past weeks to trust what she set her mind to. "That's right," he confirmed slowly. "But you held back 10 steers from the south pasture," Adeline continued. "The ones too small for the drive in spring. They wouldn't have fetched a decent price," Wyatt said, frowning, plainly unsure where this was leading. "Undersized they were," Adeline agreed. "Then. Not now." She looked up from the ledger and fixed her gaze directly on the banker, whose smug composure had begun very slightly to falter. "For 2 months, those 10 steers have had every kitchen scrap this house produces. Peelings, soured milk, the ends of every loaf. They've been fattening in the pasture, down by the creek. I've walked past them every morning carrying that slop bucket. They are not undersized any longer, Mr. Latham." She turned a page, picked up a pencil, and began writing. Her figures: "Current price in Laramie, before the drop you're so worried about, is $38 a head for prime stock. 10 prime steers is $380. Wyatt's note is for $350. Have one of the hands push those steers to the railhead in Grover tomorrow. They're on a car to Laramie by Thursday, and this note is paid in full, with $30 left over for the trouble." She slid the ledger across the table toward him. "Your money will be here on time, Mr. Latham. There's no default to discuss." The room went very quiet. Latham stared at the figures, then at the woman who had produced them, his face shifting from irritation through disbelief and settling finally on something close to fury. He had ridden out expecting an easy, disorganized rancher he could pressure into a bad deal. He had not expected to be outmaneuvered by the cook. He gathered his papers with considerably less composure than he'd arrived with, grumbled something about the bank expecting its payment on schedule, and left without another word, the buggy's wheels throwing up dust as it pulled away down the long drive. In the kitchen doorway, one of the hands let out a low, appreciative whistle, and something that was very nearly a cheer went through the men gathered there. Wyatt looked at none of them. He looked only at Adeline standing calm and steady by the table, hands folded in front of her apron as though she had not, 5 minutes earlier, single-handedly saved everything he had spent his life building. He crossed the room toward her, wanting to say something equal to the size of what he was feeling, and found, for possibly the first time in his adult life, that he did not have the words for it. She only gave him a small, quiet nod, then turned and went back to her potatoes, as though facing down a Laramie banker with a page of arithmetic were simply another item on her afternoon's list of chores. That night, Wyatt Calloway did not sleep. He lay listening to the wind picking up outside, the particular sound that in this country meant a weather change was coming, and turned the day over and over in his mind. Latham's smug certainty, the fear that had gripped his own chest before Adeline walked into the room, and then the plain, unshakable logic of what she'd laid across that table. He understood, lying there in the dark, that he had spent 5 years since his first wife's death simply surviving this ranch rather than building anything with it, running the place on memory and habit, and a grief he'd never quite set down. Adeline had arrived at his fence line like rain on parched ground and brought the whole place back to life around her and around him besides. He thought of the house without her in it now, the silence returning, the dust settling back over the mantel, meals eaten standing alone at a cold stove, and found the thought unbearable in a way it would not have been 3 months earlier. Something settled in him that night, absolute and entirely without doubt, the most certain thing he could remember feeling in years. He rose before dawn to find the world outside his window gone hushed and white, the first snow of the season fallen overnight, softening every hard edge of the land into something new and clean. He found Adeline already out on the back porch, wrapped in a shawl against the cold, a mug of coffee steaming between her hands, watching the snow fall with a calm, private contentment on her face. She did not seem surprised when he came to stand beside her. "Snow came early," she said, her breath a small white cloud in the cold air. "Does some years," he answered. Then he turned to face her fully, because the time for his usual slowness, he had decided somewhere in the sleepless hours of that night, was over. "I'm not a man with a great many words, Adeline. I see cattle and fences, and I miss the important things more often than I'd like to admit. But you saved this place yesterday, not just with a page of numbers. You've been saving it since the day I found you at that fence line. This house was just a building before you came into it. Now it's a home." He took a breath, gathering the last of his courage for the words that mattered most. "The gather's over. Your work here, the job I hired you for, that's done for the season. But I find I'm not ready for you to leave, and I don't just mean through the winter. I mean for good." He looked directly into her eyes, laying the whole of it out as plainly as he knew how. "Can you cook for 2, Adeline, permanently, as my wife?" The porch went quiet, save for the soft hiss of falling snow. Adeline's expression did not change right away, but something warm bloomed slowly in her eyes, chasing out whatever shadows had still been living there. She took a slow sip of her coffee, considering his proposal with the same unhurried deliberation she brought to everything, and then let a small, genuine smile spread across her face. "I was wondering when you'd get around to asking," she said. "You're a good man, Wyatt Calloway, just a slow one." The relief that broke across his face then was so complete it nearly buckled his knees, and the grin that followed it was the first entirely unguarded smile Adeline had ever seen from him, transforming his weathered features into something younger, lighter, almost boyish. "I expect I am," he admitted slow, "but I got there." Adeline only laughed and let him have the last word. "Before the wedding, I'll ask this once more, quickly. Become a channel member and tap join beside the channel name. It tells us stories, like this one, are worth the telling." Their courtship, in the weeks that followed, was as practical and unadorned as the two people living it. No grand gestures, no flowery declarations, just the steady shared language of work and mutual respect that had brought them together in the first place. They rode the fence lines together in the mornings. Adeline handling her borrowed mare with an easy competence that surprised none of the hands anymore. In the evenings they sat over the ledgers together, planning for spring her neat figures alongside his practical calculations. She taught him to roll out a proper pie crust. He taught her to read an approaching storm by the particular color the sky turned an hour before it broke. Cully, watching all of it from the bunkhouse porch one evening, allowed to nobody in particular that he'd never in his life seen a man improve so much on account of a woman's cooking, and everybody within earshot understood he didn't mean the cooking at all. They married a month later on a Saturday in front of the Justice of the Peace in Grover, in the same small courthouse where, not 4 months earlier, Adeline had watched the last of her old life carried out the door piece by piece. She wore a simple blue dress she'd sewn herself from cloth bought on that first supply run into town. Wyatt wore his one good suit, brushed and pressed within an inch of its life by hands more accustomed to leather and rope. The 12 hands stood up as witnesses, hats in their calloused fist, faces scrubbed pink and shining for the occasion, and even Otis Vance showed up uninvited at the edge of the small crowd, quietly settling his $20 debt with the storekeeper before slipping away without a word, which Adeline privately considered nearly as satisfying as the wedding itself. Afterward, everyone rode back out to the ranch for a wedding supper Adeline had, naturally, cooked herself, roast beef and potatoes and 3 kinds of pie, laid out on the long table where 12 hungry men had first learned to trust her months earlier, one bite at a time. That night, as the last of the hands wandered back toward the bunkhouse, under a sky gone thick with stars, Wyatt and Adeline stood together on the porch, looking out over land gone silver-white with snow. He reached for her hand, and her fingers curled around his like they had always belonged there. "Welcome home, Adeline," he said quietly. She leaned her head against his shoulder and smiled into the cold, clean night air. "I've been home a while now, Wyatt," she told him. "You were just slow to notice." 5 years later, the evening light lay long and gold across the Wyoming hills, painting the ranch house amber and rose the way it did most fine autumn evenings now. Wyatt sat on the porch swing he'd built the summer after their wedding, its familiar creak keeping time with the quiet, and Adeline came out to join him, handing him a cup of coffee, moving with the same unhurried grace she'd always carried, though the lines that hunger and grief had once cut into her face had long since smoothed into something softer, something settled. A small boy with his father's steady blue eyes and a shock of his mother's dark hair came barreling out of the house chasing a wooden horse on a string, tripped over his own feet in the yard, sat down hard in the dust, inspected his palms with fierce 3-year-old concentration. "Got your resilience," Wyatt said, quiet pride threading through his voice. "And your slowness," Adeline added, eyes bright with mischief. Took him a full minute to decide getting up was worth the trouble. Wyatt laughed, low and easy, and slid his arm around her shoulders, and she settled against him the way she had 100 evenings before this one. They sat together watching their son play as the light dropped toward the horizon, the air turning cool and sweet with the smell of cut hay and a coming rain. The life they had built together was, like the house itself, plain and solid and warmer at its core than any fire could account for, built not on one grand moment, but on the steady accumulation of small, decent ones. A mended shirt, a hard truth spoken plainly across a kitchen table, a hand reached for in the dark, and found there every single time. "Remember that, banker?" Wyatt asked, his voice a low murmur in the settling dusk. "Latham," Adeline said. I remember him thinking a ledger was only about numbers. He never once understood it was the whole year written down. The hard work, the lean months, everything a person puts into the ground and hopes will grow back. "And the 10 steers," Wyatt added, a smile working into his voice. "And the 10 steers," she agreed. He tightened his arm around her, drawing her closer, and thought not for the first time of the starving woman he had found kneeling at his fence line, eating chokecherries off a dying bush, and of the woman sitting beside him now, the anchor of his whole life, the mother of his son. Lonely man and seen where everyone else, in 3 counties, had seen only ruin exactly what both of them were worth. He had been a slow man his whole life, by his own admission and everyone else's. But he had gotten there in the end, in time to ask the one question that mattered, and he had never once regretted the answer. Otis Vance, for his part, had become something unlikely over those 5 years, not quite a friend, by Wyatt's own reckoning, but a neighbor, who no longer bet against them, and who had taken every fall gather since to sending one of his own hands over with a case of good whiskey and a note that simply read, Cully had stayed on as foreman, gray creeping into his hair now, and swore up and down to any new hand who'd listen that he'd known Adeline Calloway was something special from the very first meal, a claim that made Adeline laugh outright every time she overheard it, remembering rather clearly the wager he'd nearly lost thanks to Otis Vance's $20. That's the whole of it. A woman with nothing but a carpetbag and more grit than the whole county gave her credit for, and a man too guarded to ask for help until help knelt down at his own fence line. If a story like Adeline's is the kind that keeps you coming back to this channel, the best thing you can do is like it. Leave a word below about which part landed hardest for you, and subscribe so the next one finds you. If you want more stories like hers, tap Join beside the channel name and become a channel member. It's what keeps this channel going.